Hi there everyone. Just wanted to fill you in on a little bit of a foreword before this particular podcast starts. So, Sam and I are going to be talking quite a lot about the findings of some of the polls that he did on his Instagram, and also some of the polls done by the Washington Post. I was originally going to edit these into the video so that they can be screened as you're watching, but the conversation was moving so fast and sometimes they'd be up so little before we'd moved on to the next point that I thought that the best way to give the information to you would be in a PDF. So the link to those PDFs is in the description down below for you to have a look at them at your own leisure and see them at your own pace. I hope that you enjoy the podcast today. Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Amiable Arguments. I'm Luca, again, the same person as last time, because it's my show, and I'm joined today by Sam. So, hi.
Hello. Hey, Luca. How's it going?
It's going all right. Thank you, Sam. Thank you for being with me today.
You're more than welcome.
I have to say, I just want to say to the people listening that when I first started this podcast, the subject that we're going to talk about today is one that I'm very happy and welcome to talk about, but it's not one that I ever actually thought I'd get to, not certainly on the fourth podcast of the show. So I'm actually quite, I think it'll be a delicate conversation, but I think it should be, hopefully, if we get this right, a very important one and one that
Definitely.
could be very well, just I think very valuable for us and for the people listening. So, Sam, now that I'm going to stop being mysterious, do you want to tell people what we're discussing?
So today I came to Luca saying I wish to discuss, to keep it general, sex, but more specifically, sexual education and analysing that further, the topic of consent.
There you are. So
Yes,
that's what we're discussing today. And Sam's been very thorough because he's been doing some polls on his Instagram, which I've no doubt he's going to shill to you at some point.
Well, I mean, you've just done it yourself there. I was going to hold off for as long as possible, and then you just dropped me in it now. So
he got me. He got me.
I have to do a shameless plug.
Go on.
But no, you're quite correct. So my Instagram, if anyone's interested, is @sample_96. And pretty much since the beginning of last summer, as a way to put off lockdown boredom, I've just been doing general polls to the public. And most of them have been fairly light-hearted. You know, what's your favourite Christmas song? What's the best chocolate biscuit? What's the best packet of crisps? In the last few months, I've sort of thought if I've got an engaging platform, I might as well try and find something useful out of it. And I've also been looking around topics of sort of sex and relationships, contraception, and more recently the topic of consent. And I was inspired to do this study. There's a great book that I read around Christmas time last year. It's called Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell, and it's sort of like an in-depth look at how terrible we pretty much are at human beings as judging someone we don't really know. And he gives various examples, you know, to do with police in America, meeting people at parties, even, well, I'm sure you're aware, the history buff, Luca, of Neville Chamberlain's meeting with Hitler and him being all very much like, oh, Hitler says he's not going to start a war, so I believe him.
The great practical joke of the 20th century by Neville Chamberlain, yes.
So it's a really interesting look. Like, not all the points hit home, but there's some really, really interesting ones. And when he was on the topic of house parties and things, he obviously goes into consent, and he brings up a study that the Washington Post did, I believe it was in 2015, where they surveyed 1,000 college students. I'm not entirely sure on the ratio. I would like to assume it was 500 male to female. Granted, they didn't include non-binary, and the results are pretty eye-opening. I realise I'm monologuing, Lucas, so feel free to interject at any point.
Well, no, the beauty of this is that I can just sort of take a back seat if I feel that the other person has, you know, a lot to get off the chest, or if they have more authority on the subject. But obviously, it's well, what I like about that is that obviously we're going to be dealing with statistics that are quite current. I mean, 5 years in the grand scheme of things isn't that long. I don't think societies have moved that much in 5 years. So and actually the thing that's I think going to be interesting here is when we break down Sam's poll, which is only a small one by comparison, but still the difference, some differences and some similarities in the statistics will be interesting. And also just to say that this is probably going to be obviously a podcast with a lot of numbers and a lot of statistics. So I will aim to edit the numbers into the video so that people, if they want to see them on screen as we're talking, they'll be able to do that. Although I'm not an editing whiz, so I apologise if it isn't perfect. And I will link the articles that Sam's talking about in the description below.
Yeah. But first, before we touch onto that, and just in case I didn't clarify, I recreated these polls. I was influenced by the Malcolm Gladwell surveys that he showed, and I sought to redo them and see if any results would differ, if they'd be the same to UK, US audiences. But first, Luke, I'm just going to push the rewind button, as it were, and I just wanted to ask a sort of general question.
Sure.
Because you and me, we will have been in the same school year, but we didn't meet until later on in life. So I just wanted to ask you, Luca, what was your... And you can give as much or as little information as you want. I don't want to push you. What was your sort of sexual education like as a kid? And this includes both your schooling and as in your family life as well.
Sure. Well, this is quite a turn. I'm the one being interviewed now.
I know, I've completely flipped this on its head.
How does this happen? Right, no, okay, that's fair. So my earliest memories of anything to do with sex education are probably from when I was about 7 or 8. I remember having to take a letter home for my parents to sign saying that they only described it to me as a video. Right. For all I knew, that could have been a video with, Stuart Little on it. I didn't know what the video was, but obviously my parents did. And so they consented for me to watch this video, and then I sat in a class watching some very, very mild, obviously, sex education videos. Although something probably worth mentioning was I was talking to my housemates about this sort of thing in preparation for doing this podcast, and they said that when they were going through the same sort of thing at my age, the sexes were actually segregated to watch different to watch different videos, whereas I have no memory of that happening. I was in a class amongst all of the students in it, and we just sat and watched all of it together like one big happy 8-year-old family. And then I suppose from there, another memory I have is sort of I remember things slowly coming together. Like as I got older, it was almost like you were being drip fed the information little by little. It starts with, well, boys have penises and girls have vaginas, and all that sort of stuff. And you go, yeah, I knew that, but and then probably depending on which one you were at the age of 5, you're like, oh, that's what the other one looks like, but then obviously you get up to, I think by about year 5, I have vivid memories of year 5, so I'd have been about 10 at that point, I think. And then I think at that point I have memories of the videos being shown in class discussing the more intimate aspects of intercourse. And I remember one particular little kid in the class just raising his hand at the end when we were doing sort of Q&A with the teacher, and he was like, "Miss, have you ever had sex?" And her just being really bashful and embarrassed and denying it completely, which obviously right now that's probably a lie. But then honestly, for the most part, most of my memories are actually of talking to my dad and my parents about such things. They're the ones that I think have actually had the most impact on my understanding and than anything that I was taught in school. So in a monologuing way, that's my answer.
No, that's fair. Interesting that you comment on being 7 years old, and because I don't remember being asked to sign a consent letter, and B, I have no memory of sex ed from that young an age. My earliest memories, like you, it'll have been year 5, year 6, and like you, we were all together in one class. Although I do remember when I was in year 3 or 4, the girls had to stay behind where periods and stuff were discussed.
Right.
Like now, as I'm older, I kind of feel maybe that talk should be beneficial to guys as well. Maybe not at that early an age, but there certainly should be a time before you get into secondary school where it should maybe be mentioned to guys. I don't know, but that's a tangent. But I vividly remember this cartoon of a man and a woman chasing each other around the bedroom with a feather. Does that ring any bells to you, or is that just me?
You know what? Now that you've mentioned it, I think a penny has hit, and I do vaguely remember something like that. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I sort of look back at that and think, God, that's tame, I would say, for year 5 and 6. All it is showing that people enjoy sex. Oh my God. But yet the other day I was looking it up just to try and watch it ideally, and I couldn't find it. But what I did find is that so many boards and councils complained about that sort of segment in particular that it was banned.
Really?
And I kind of think, Jesus, if people are getting upset about a cartoon feather chasing bedroom antic, then there's some issues. But similarly to you, I just remember the teachers being sort of really awkward and embarrassed about the whole thing.
Yes.
Like they pretty much had very little to do. It was just, let's just sit the kids in front of a video. And if there's a question, I will answer it. But yeah, I think from what I can remember, teachers, especially in primary school, were very embarrassed about it. And to be fair, I have more memory of that than sex ed through secondary school. Like, this may come as a shock, and maybe you were shown it by a sex ed lesson in secondary school. I was never even shown the classic condom on a banana. That's how.
I think I had that at secondary school in what's the order of the letters? PSHCE. Which we had.
Yours had a C in it.
Yeah.
Just PSHE.
Couldn't tell you what it stood for.
The C was condom on a banana, clearly. Yeah. That's what I was missing out on.
Well, we had that once a fortnight. That is to say, classes to do with anything to do with social cohesion and just those sorts of things. But yes, on the one particular one, we had, I think, condoms on cucumbers when I was in year 9, something like that. And to be fair, that's probably the last memory I actually have of anything to do with that subject.
Fair. Like, I distinctly remember a school nurse came in, and if you wanted to go see her, I think, because my brother said he went to go see her, and that's where he had the whole, you've got to demonstrate how to put a condom on a penis. But because I wasn't sexually active at that time, I was kind of like, well, I don't feel like I need that. But I just find it weird that was only shown to some people rather than everyone. Because I went to an all-boys school, and I just feel everyone would have benefited from seeing it. But there we go. And I also remember someone external coming in to talk about STDs, and I think that might have been year 9 or 10, so I was 14, 15. But the thing is, he was, showing us all these grisly pictures and personal stories, and I thought, this is all great. I know what these things are, but it's like I feel like I don't even know how to get these things in the first place. So I just feel like.
Your 15-year-old head's just going, this is the kind of violent, sort of disgusting stuff I'm not allowed to see at home, so you just, but yeah.
Well, I feel that all those, the grisly pictures, and I'm pretty sure most young girls are shown a baby being born. I almost feel like it's more of an effort to get people to abstain from it rather than educate. But let's get to a point, man, I'm waffling already.
Yeah, getting away from I remember.
Yeah, I got most of my education from my family, specifically my mum.
Yes.
Who's very sort of open to A, questioning, and B, sitting down and like, have you discussed this kind of thing? But I think what the issue is, just while we're on sex ed, before we go into the tangent, I think there's an expectation that parents expect the school to teach it, and the school vice versa expect it to be taught by the parents. And because there's no sort of consensus on who should be doing the teaching, I feel a lot of kids grow up quite confused.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, isn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, I've certainly heard some arguments that school is just, it's. I suppose really that the answer is, as in many things in life, somewhere in the middle.
Mm,
It's not. It's not on. Certainly, if I were a parent, I wouldn't send my kids to school and then hope that they only learn in school, and I'd never
yeah,
invest any sort of time into their learning. But obviously, vice versa, you also hope that they go to school and get a good education about life, about people who perhaps have been what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, who are qualified to teach things about on
mm,
all these different subjects in an academic and professional way. So yeah, I suppose the answer is somewhere in the middle. But I suppose that what just obviously I know it's just lived experience, but between me and Sam here, I think we're both sort of come to the same conclusion that we got far more impact from learning from home than we did from learning from school.
yeah. And I wouldn't even say that the school was bad. I know people have had far worse. Like people have been to, private, religious private schools where they're taught barely anything, if anything at all.
You'll never need to know because you'll never have sex. That's
Yeah, exactly. Um, but I keep on having to refocus on one of that. During your sexual education, be it from primary school, be it from secondary school, do you have any memories, either vague or specific, of consent being mentioned? Or do you think it was more of an afterthought?
It's hard to tell how much is just from my very loose memory, and it's hard to tell
Mm,
because, to be frank, most of my memory of the real ins and outs of what I learnt at school are pretty flaky. Like
yeah,
beyond the really recent stuff, obviously. Like
that's fair.
I think, like most people, we remember moments more than we remember entire lessons. But I certainly think that from memory, I can't remember a great deal about such matters. It was,
Mm,
I'd say, I'm sure it must have been discussed, and I'm sure we would have had things about yes and no means no and all those sorts of things. I have the vaguest memories of things like that,
yeah,
but again, most of it comes from home.
fair. No, I would agree. Funny you mentioned that no means no, because if I had to give any sort of rough guess as to what the message was, if and when I was taught
Mm.
consent, it would be more on the argument of the no means no.
Mm.
And obviously today it's a questionable phrase, I think, and I think people are starting to move towards a yes means yes instead, which I think is a lot more. Um, it's a lot sort of safer, assured, but we'll get to that. So then this leads me on to this survey.
I'm enjoying
Yay,
watching this. I know I should
we
keep
got
it
there.
focused myself, but I'm enjoying watching him fluster, so it's fine.
It's true. Like if you ever saw me do a presentation at school, I could waffle for hours.
I'll keep it short, don't worry, folks.
So as I say, so this survey was done in 2017 by the Washington Post, and there was a governing body involved, but it's slipped my mind at present. And I think there was about 50 questions, but I haven't been able to find the full survey online due to, as with most sort of Washington Post articles, you have to pay for it. And but in the book, there's a selection of about I think 6 or 7 questions. So we'll roughly go through them now, and then we'll move on to as I repeated the survey. So the first question and the words, the first 6 questions in the book. It says that students were asked, does the following give is it an indication of consent?
Yes.
Was pretty much the gist of it. And so the first one is if the other person takes off their own clothes, is that an indication of consent? And
Well,
overall,
let's start on this
sorry.
one first before we reel off all 6. We'll just go one down the line.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And so approximately it was about 50-50 yes or no percent. 3% depends, 1% no opinion. And it was exactly 50% of men thought that was consent for more activity, and 44% of women said yes. So it was, unlike some of the other questions, there was pretty much
there's a bit of
the same
parity in
both
there.
for
Yeah,
men
it's
and
quite
women.
even. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to drop my poll in now, or should we go over it after we've finished?
Yeah, no. Let's talk about what the result is for each question and your results, and then we'll go through them one by one with each.
So, I mean, personally, I'm surprised the numbers are that high, especially for yes, that someone takes off their own clothes. That's consent for more.
And sorry, Sam, if I could just interrupt as well, because I've got the picture here of those statistics in front of me, and I'll try put them on the screen as well. But what's quite interesting is that in the 2015 Washington Post survey, it's very equal between men and women as well. It's not just equal between those that think yes and those that think no, but even the men and women. It's slightly less for women, but not by a significant margin.
Yeah, it's 50% yes for men, 44% yes for women. So it's still pretty close and pretty approximately close to half, which surprised me. Then in my survey, which I ran a couple of weeks ago, granted the survey sample size was much lower. It was about 100 compared to 1,000. And in my poll, the ratio to men to women was about 3 women to 1 man. So I can't preach the same level of accuracy or whatever, but just for comparison reasons, the results were as followed. That overall, if you put all the results together, the average was 14% yes, 42% said no, 43% said depends, and 1% said no opinion. So there's a much larger shift from the yes votes in the American survey to the depends. And I'd say make a mental note of that, because this comes it's more of a pattern throughout, but we'll get on to that. Thoughts, Luca?
Well, thoughts are that the fact that we've basically gone from the Washington Post poll, which depends, is basically 3. Is that to say 3%? For
3% of all the participants, including men and women, said depends.
Whereas with Sam's, obviously, most of them, that there are probably more for depends in terms of men, and between women, it's mostly either no, it doesn't give consent, or B, with 39%, it depends. So obviously these are matters I would deduce from just looking at these statistics of circumstance. It's a circumstantial thing between the individuals involved. I know that's probably not saying anything much and probably stating the obvious, but it seems to be the safest opinion that you can come to. It's not about because it's hard, because when you get asked a question like this in the survey, it's probably in some sort of arbitrary, thing of just, if you were to take your clothes off in front of a man, or if you're a man to take your clothes off in front of a woman, does that give consent? And I suppose that the people thinking in the depends category are thinking probably, well, it depends on the circumstances, it depends who it's with, and I would press further that it might also depend on your state of mind. Are you inhibited by alcohol and such factors?
I mean, alcohol is its own massive conversation, completely separate. I mean, let's try and
keep
focus on sober sex before we even get to that discussion. We'll rattle through these more quickly, because I guess if you are putting these stats up on the video, I guess we don't need to go through them as in depth.
Sure.
But then the next question was, if the other person gets a condom, is that consent for more sex? In America, overall, it was 40% yes, 54% no, 4% depends, 1% no opinion, with substantially a greater gap, I should say, between women saying yes and no, 38 to 58, and men was 43 to 51, yes and no. In my survey, it was quite a spread of results. Overall, 32% said yes, 31% said no, 35% said depends. So and this isn't the only example of that. It's very difficult, as Malcolm Gladwell would say, to if there's when there's no consensus, it's very difficult to establish what is right and wrong if people have no idea or very different opinions, I should say.
Well,
as to what is.
I could give a bit of input into this, I suppose, with just saying that this is unlike the one before, which is just take off your clothes. I suppose this one is obviously, because of the nature of what it's asking, a bit more of a gendered question. So, for example, obviously, if a guy just goes and gets a condom, and you say, is that legitimate consent? Well, the answer could be no, because it's simply a case of, well, what if he's going to put it on and the woman might not want that to happen? But I would say on the flip side that if the woman goes and gets a condom, you can see how that completely flips it on its head, because it's simply a matter of, well, what utility could she find for it other than what it was made for? Unless, I suppose, you were making big old balloons for some reason, but let's not go into that.
Yeah. But again, it's once again quite split results, and this is echoed. I mean, I'll just brush over the next couple of questions, just because I want to get on to other things.
Yeah, sure.
The next question was nods in agreement. In America, it was very much almost a 50-50 split between yes and no overall. And then in my poll, there was a much larger quantity going for depends. As I say, this was echoed quite a lot through my polls. Whereas in America, a lot of the people were either yes or no about it, very black or white.
Yeah.
Seemingly in the UK, there's people seem to view on circumstance or believe there's some sort of grey area. In the next question, engages in foreplay. The last couple of questions were more interesting. In America, there was a much higher lean towards no, and similarly in the UK, there was a much higher lean towards no. So that's like the first correlation across the board. And then similarly with the next question, if someone does not say no, in both studies, the majority was for no, which I think is quite reassuring, because I think out of all these situations, to me at least, this is the most obvious no, that is not a form of consent.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it kind of goes back to what we were saying at the beginning of going from the no means no angle to the yes means yes angle, which are different, they're the same but different, which obviously because they're both looking to achieve the same thing, which is just consent, but the difference between how they're asked is actually quite large.
Yeah, because the thing is, if we were both sort of taught no means no, and along with the rest of the country. I mean, I'm not going to comment on the US because I don't know as much. But if you go off no means no, to me that's implying you try something on until you were stopped. There's an element of, just go for it.
And see how far you get.
Exactly. And I think that carries a lot of danger and a lot of risk and a lot of not uncarishness, that's not a word.
You've made it a word.
Yeah. It's a lack of care and a lack of attention, especially for your other partner. Or partners. I'm not who am I to judge. And then later on in the survey, it switched, the question header switched, as it were, and students were asked, does the following situation count as sexual assault? Which is obviously a very delicate subject. I'm not going to crack any jokes or anything. The question was, is it sexual assault when both people have not given clear agreement? And in America, roughly about 50% said it is, and roughly 50% said it's unclear. In the UK / my survey, overall it was about 38% for is and 51% for unclear. So again, similar results across the pond, as it were. And Malcolm Gladwell, I'm going to read a quote from him, if I may, or are you anti sort of copyright infringement? Is there a word limit?
I don't know. This is uncharted territory for me. Just read and we'll see how it goes.
Yes, okay. I said I wasn't going to crack a joke. I just did there, so I apologise. Give me a second. I should have prepared this.
No, that's
But
all right.
we can skip over. We can edit it out.
No, there will be no editing.
Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Talking to Strangers, which I recommend, he said, "What does it mean that half of all young men and women are unclear on whether clear agreement is necessary for sexual activity? Does it mean that they haven't thought about it before? Does it mean that they would rather proceed on a case-by-case basis? Does it mean they reserve the right to sometimes proceed without explicit consent and at other times to insist on it? When one college student meets another, even in cases where both have the best of intentions, the task of inferring sexual intent from behaviour is essentially a coin flip. As legal scholar Laurie Shaw asks, how can we expect students to respect boundaries when no consensus exists as to what they are?"
Well, they've just laid out the big questions, haven't they?
But I think it's very interesting. And then my question to you is, do you think this is a reflection on our sexual education system? When people have such differing opinions, what is the way to go about adjusting it?
Yes. I suppose, upon reflection, this is quite an interesting place that we've gotten to now, seeing there's, and I promise this will be relevant, that I've done 4 podcasts up till now, one on the East and the West, one on the Labour Party, one talking about cancel culture, and now one talking about sexual consent, and somehow this is the one that I feel the least qualified to talk about, which I think is quite bad because it's the one that I should be the most sure of myself on and have the most information on, which I suppose is something to possibly reflect on. But I would say that looking at the statistics for that particular one and going off the questions that you've just asked from the book, I suppose that it is a matter of, it's very hard, and this isn't me making excuses, this is me, I suppose, just adding more questions and more food for thought, but it's very hard to define a boundary with something as intimate and personal as this, when every individual's boundaries will be different. That is just something worth thinking about.
No, and I thoroughly agree. And as I was going to get to, but again, I've gone off on tangents. I did a follow-up just because I had some great discussions with people following my posting of this repeat survey.
Sure.
Had some great discussions, and I thought, based on these discussions I was having with people, points they were coming to me as, I put together some more questions and wanted to see what sort of reaction they would get as well. And I don't want to say that it was relieving, but it was definitely interesting for these follow-up questions. There was a much more majority answer. It was far less spread out and divided as the previous questions. So I asked questions such as, can consent be non-verbal? The majority of people were saying yes. Do you find consent awkward or a turn-off? Most people said no. Does context and partner have an impact on how explicit consent needs to be? A lot of yeses.
Then
interestingly, sorry, go again.
No, that's okay. You just rambled through point 3 a little bit quickly. I'm just scared the mic might pick it up.
I'm aware I can speak 100 miles an hour.
No, it's okay. It was just that one question.
Does context and partner have an impact on how explicit consent needs to be? The overall majority was for yes. Should you ask for consent before kissing someone? This was quite an interesting one. Over 50% said they were unsure. But again, as we are saying, if we're both saying circumstance and context does have a lot to do with it, and this isn't exactly surprising. And then the final question, can consent be given if both partners are drunk? This was quite divisive. It was about 30% for yes, no, and unsure. But I'll sweep that aside, and if we have time, we'll come to it later, because the first thing I'd like to do is just more get to the bottom.
Yeah, okay.
Before alcohol comes even into it. So what some people are saying, because obviously we'll talk about no means no, and now what's sort of being pushed more, and I think rightly so, is more a yes means yes. But I do find it interesting that yes means yes originated in the US, where they've spent $2 billion on abstinence as the main form of sexual education. But that's another point to make, but I do find it interesting. I think it was California. I think yes means yes is a much clearer way of getting consent. But here's the thing, like if people are saying, because in prep for this I went looking up I just asked the internet, how is consent defined? And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Hannah Witten. She's a great YouTuber who discusses sex explanation, sex and periods and relationships. She's great, but she's done a book, and she defines sex as a voluntary, enthusiastic yes. It's unassumed and it's mandatory. Consent can be verbal or non-verbal, withdrawn at any point, and for some things and not others. I'd say that's a pretty decent definition.
I mean, it's a long definition, but I think with a definition like that, it requires you to be thorough. It requires a lot of covering of a lot of bases very quickly, so that's actually quite precise, yeah.
But what's interested me is, and I've had some discussions with others, is if we're putting, this is another point I was going to get to, if we're putting verbal and non-verbal consent on the same platform, verbal, most of the time, bar some extreme circumstances, there's no grey area, shall we say.
No.
Whereas I think the trouble with non-verbal consent is it's entirely subjective to one person.
Yes.
And another.
Well, let me just come back to you on that one, because I'd like to talk a little bit about your point 4. Should you ask for consent before kissing someone? This statistic really interested me.
Yeah.
Really interested me, because I suppose if we're talking about something as, going, between shaking hands and going all the way, so to speak.
Yeah.
The kiss probably it's intimate, it's personal, but it's not, it's not the most extreme thing, let's just say. So I think it's quite a nice talking point to go to work around. So the fact that so many are unsure, and that's quite consistent across the genders, and the fact that but it's there's far more people then in the yes category of yes, you should ask for consent before kissing someone, as opposed to the no category, particularly for women. And what I find very interesting about this particular one is how large the unsure one is of this particular category. And I would suspect, merely from the thoughts going off the top of my head and what I've seen in, I think a lot of that might come from pop culture. I think a lot of this is...
That's an interesting point.
...is to do with how things are viewed in romance literature, in rom-coms, in love stories, in all those sorts of things. Because I think that something that is quite exciting for people, particularly in those stories, is obviously a feeling of spontaneity.
Yes.
It's about things sweeping you off your feet and you didn't see it coming, and then it happens and it's wonderful and all those sorts of things. Very rarely, most of the people in those stories, certainly in the ones in the more mainstream, view, for the larger audiences, shall we say, most of the time that doesn't end badly. Most of the time, the protagonists and the main characters in those stories would, quote unquote, read the signals right. Yeah. And everything turns out all right and it's wonderful. But I suppose that comes down to the fact that life is messier than that. And often we can get the signals badly wrong. And even if we don't mean any particular harm to the people that they're done to, it can... we can find ourselves in a great deal of mess, and I think that's quite heavily represented in the unsure category. That
I think once again it's obviously very circumstantial. I think most would argue if you've been married for 40 years, I don't think most would expect to have to go to their partner washing up by the sink and say, "Can I have a kiss.
Well, I think it depends on how happy the marriage is after 40 years.
Well, I mean, that's a good conversation to have in itself. But that's a really interesting point you made about the media and Hollywood and stuff, and how it can lead to sort of some mixed ideas of how to so often in romance movies it's seemingly signaled as a romantic gesture if you're like chasing a woman through an airport or in a car, and stuff. It's made out to be really a heroic and charming thing.
Well, I mean,
charming, I think it's like definitely a good word.
Yeah, it's like the finale of Friends.
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, look at Love Actually. The guy just turning up to Andrew Lincoln turning up to Keira Knightley's doorstep and just like, hey, look how romantic this is. And I just think it gives a bad idea. I mean, it's comparable. Like, I don't want to sound like I'm that guy saying video games causes mass. Like, I don't want mass shootings. I don't want to come across like that.
No.
But for both the media and porn, while we're on this sort of subject, and I'm not anti-porn, when people aren't getting educated in school or by parents, just to throw it back, then they're obviously going to go to these other sources of information. And when you're seeing these supposedly charming gestures, and this is even before sex comes into the fray, where it's, you have to be daring and you have to be confident. And this is true for both men and women, but I would say certainly for men, it's seemingly implied that you have to, be confident, charming, and know what you're doing. And if you show any sign of hesitation, asking, is this okay, you're seen as weaker or quote unquote lesser of a man. And that's something I've never really thought about before, so thank you for raising it. But I think that's definitely a factor in why consent could be so unthought of to some people, because they've just been so influenced by certain things they've seen.
And like you say, I mean, Love Actually isn't some fringe, film that.
It's not like a teen comedy. American Pie, where they're just screwing each other all the time. It's a
cult classic. It's on not every Christmas. It's.
Yeah, I mean, while we're on it, similarly in films, when do you ever A, hear sexual consent, or B, even foreplay? Like, it's always two strangers meet in a bar, cut to, they're tearing each other's clothes off against a wall. It's just like, where was the walking home and the, do you want a coffee and shall we do this kind of thing?
You can tell Sam watched a lot of films in preparation for this talk.
No, it's just that it's a very interesting point now that I think about it, how it's completely misrepresented. Similarly, I think a lot of people are brought up with the idea that, if you get the kiss going, kissing leads to touching, leads to more kissing, leads to more touching, leads to sex. And I think a lot of people seem to think that it's all connected. It's like not a slippery slope, but it's like once you've got the ball rolling, it's all
it just keeps going down the hill.
People think we're making out, so I can put a hand down there, I can grope something. And I guess if you're getting most of your information from school chums, I can understand how that comes to pass. Even if we're going to use the cliche, did you get to first base, bro, or second base sort of thing, it's all implied as one run.
Yes, it is. It's
no one talks about you have to get to first base and then ask if you can go to second base, bro. It's all just classed as one.
But even in the way that that's framed, it comes back to a thing we were discussing of it's all about how far did you get. It's all about how far did you get. So that's a very good point. Anyway, so let's try and move away from the pop culture stuff now, because it was more just a query that I had. Is there? So there's more to this poll, is there, that you'd like to?
Well, I mean, I roughly mentioned a couple of these follow-up questions as we discussed the should you ask for consent before kissing someone. And I won't go into alcohol just yet because I don't think we've got the time. That's another question in itself. But for example, does context and partner have an impact on how explicit consent needs to be? And this seems to be quite a divisive thing that between a lot of people. some people argue that you should always, always, always ask for consent, no matter who the partner is, no matter how long you've been seeing them, or if it's a new partner.
Which number is this? I'm just trying to find it myself.
This is on the second poll, and I believe, just give me a second, it is number 3.
Oh yes, I've got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the overwhelming number of people said yes, and I would agree. But when we get into this, it's sort of how, I guess, in longer relationships, how is consent done? And a lot of people would argue body language, or it just gets into a routine so much that you don't have to ask. But then is that walking into dangerous territory? Because when we consider the stats that, I'm not sure on the male cases, but it's obviously women who are being assaulted a lot more than men are. And when you look at those stats even further, I believe it's about 90% of these cases are with someone they know,
yes,
be it a partner, be it a friend, as opposed to the stereotype of some creep dragging you out in the street kind of thing.
Yes.
Now, granted, I'm not sure how many of those cases are a friend taking advantage, if alcohol is involved, or it's a partner misreading signals. But I think again, it's a lot to do with context, and if you've made sort of previous agreements with your significant other, then that's between you. I don't think there needs to be very mandatory laws put in place saying you've got to have this 3-step process in order to get the consent. I don't think it needs to come to that.
Well, the problem is, even if it did come to that, how on earth would you regulate it?
No, exactly, because as we've seen in high-profile sexual assault cases, people don't have CCTV cameras in bedrooms unless they're into voyeurism. There's never a third party there.
Yeah.
And it often ends up one person's word against the other. And as we say, especially if someone's relying on non-verbal consent, they're then relying on body language, and what can be obvious to one person isn't obvious to another person. And what is interesting, because I was looking up the law, as it were, of the consent, and it goes back to the Sexual Offences Act 2003, and it goes into the obvious things. But part of what is criteria for convicting someone, person A does not reasonably believe that B consents, which I think is such a vague wording.
Well, you find a lot of this in the laws.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff in that things are so open to interpretation. I mean, it's like another law that was passed just off the top of my head in 2003, which was the Communications Act, and their Section 127. It's something that it says anything sent online that could be deemed grossly offensive. It's like, well, who decides that? Who interprets
exactly.
that? These are the this is where it all sort of breaks down from a lack of clarity in the law. And the problem is that I suppose it doesn't help, because you can define these things and the judge can decide these things after the fact, but you need to. It's about education, so that there has to be no after the fact, so that these things can be proactively solved, not retroactively solved.
No, that's a very good point. And then we come back to how does one solve that?
Well, yeah, I think this is where it's all been going to, hasn't it? This is now we've been through the data.
And a follow-up question I did as part of this survey, which I didn't include on the spreadsheet I sent you, because I was asking for words rather than just a yes or no answer, and I was asking, how do you define consent? And the majority of cases were a clear, enthusiastic yes. And I think that can incorporate body language, that can incorporate speech. If someone, if someone is clearly enjoying themselves and seems really into it, and you've asked them, there can be no doubt. I think some people, if they are just reading off body language, there's nothing wrong with double checking. Like, as one of my follow-up questions was, seemingly, and I'd like to hope people were being honest and not just trying to pick the morally right answer. Consent doesn't appear to be a turn-off to people. Maybe people mentally think it is because of the media, etc., as we've discussed. But if we've now, in theory, been given the go-ahead to double-check and ask these questions, then we should all go for it. Which makes it sound a lot simpler than it is, and granted, it can be very complicated. And as I say, this is before we've even discussed alcohol, which we can potentially say for another.
Well, it is very complicated because, I don't know much about sexual consent in ancient Egypt, but I imagine that this is something that we've been dealing with and will be a problem for a long time to come. It's it's one of the world's oldest problems, isn't it? It's a very difficult subject to talk about because I, like I say, not feeling like an authority on it, but I suppose, the little things that we can do to, because I suppose now the thoughts coming to my head are, if anything, as we've sort of discussed on a personal level, it's very hard because, particularly from a school point of view, because you don't feel like you've been properly equipped with the lessons and the skills to go into that field. So I suppose that any endeavour to create more dialogue on this subject, whether it simply be your polls or people talking like this to try and get the conversation going, and obviously including women in the conversation as well. We just happen to be two guys talking about the subject, but it's important to just let anyone and everyone allow themselves to be heard in this, so we can come to a better understanding of this subject matter. Because
precisely, you've hit the nail on the head. And I didn't come here with any sense of sort of superior authority just because I'd done these polls. It was entirely on, as you said, a way to open and raise discussion, and that was completely the point with the polls as well. It wasn't to prove a theory I had or prove an agenda of one sex over another or anything like that. It was merely a curiosity to open discussion, and I was quite pleasantly surprised, I will say, that most of the discussions I had following the polls were with women, and I think that's great that they feel that I'm a worthy person to talk about it with, because I think that there's such a divide sometimes with these sorts of discussions, and it's like, oh, who are you to say this and say that sort of thing. And I think, considering how popular just sex is amongst the general public, it baffles me how it's still such a taboo topic.
Yeah.
And I think, as you say, it's just all about discussion and openness. I do, just to go back to what I believe I said in my opening statement, I think a lot of it will come from improving sex ed at schools, because I think there's a lot to be desired. Given the fact that our memories were patchy, I think that says a lot. But even in terms of reassuring that it's not just a reproductive thing, that is as much for pleasure. Because I remember sort of being taught about, the anatomy and stuff, but it was very much heavily more on pregnancy and the gestation of a baby and
but
stuff.
These are all biological factors.
No, I know. And I can understand that sort of being taught in a science context, and as I say, whilst I don't think my sex ed was bad necessarily, I think there could have been a lot more included. While I'm at it, I think, again, both porn and the media have influenced that sex is all about, say, penetration, for example, and it's more about a man's pleasure, for example. And I think that's something that needs to be undone. Penetration isn't the main aspect of it necessarily. There's plenty of other fun you can have.
We all know it's the running around tickling each other with feathers, like on the original.
But like, I think it's ingrained in society. Even if when people are talking about did you have sex, they class it as did the penis go into the vagina or the vulva, if you will. And by that logic, there's plenty of homosexuals who therefore haven't lost their virginity. It's a silly thing amongst many other silly things that I think are ingrained and need re-examining.
So you
And
would. Sorry, finish your point. Forgive me.
I've lost it.
Oh no, that's
like,
all right.
A lot of things need re-examining and re-looked at, and as you say, I'm waffling again, but as you say, the key is more open discussion about it.
Yes, and as you would advocate, it's about a reform of sexual education to focus more heavily on consent.
I mean, yes, that is why I came here today, and I've gone off on a million tangents. But I think yes,
I helped.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I think emphasising that it's not uncool or awkward to ask, especially if you aren't sure. Clarify if someone's getting turned off by you asking, "Is this okay?" They're probably not the sort of person you want to be having sex with anyway. Just encouraging it and being open about it, and not make it an awkward and taboo thing. Normalizes it. It's thrown about a lot these days, but the second it's more openly discussed and encouraged, I think it can be implemented more.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, we'll leave it there then, because we're coming up to about an hour. So Sam, thank you ever so much for.
You're most welcome. You can pour some syrup on that waffle while you're at it.
Thank you very much for coming to me today, and honestly, with complete sincerity, thank you for coming here with this topic. Because
thank you for listening.
Yeah, because I truly think that it's an immensely important topic, and I hope that those listening feel that we've had a little bit of light fun, and we've had some jokes just to keep it amiable, as it were. But ultimately, I hope that we've both handled this with the delicacy and the care that it deserves, because it certainly matters. I think we both find it completely important. This is something that is not obviously a British issue. It's a global issue, because we all are men and women, and we all have sex, and these things matter to each and every one of us. So thank you for listening. I will post a link in the description below to both Irina's artwork that we'll be covering over this podcast. I will also shill Sam's Instagram account, seeing as he doesn't care that much about staying anonymous, and therefore you can help broaden his poll size. That wasn't a pun about his member. That was me talking about his polls. And
precisely.
My gosh, who's waffling now? Anyway, I'm just going to end this. Right. Thank you everyone for listening, and join me next time for the next amiable argument. Thank you.